Hello everyone, we're now beginning Chapter 7 on information processing. It, along with the chapter on intelligence, are my two longest chapters. There are 7 sections. Here we're going to begin with Section 1, which is the history of information processing. This is an overview of the entire chapter. One of the criticisms of information processing theory is that it just seems to be a mishmash, a catch-all for a number of topics related to cognitive processing. If you will look at this flow chart, and by the way, flow charts are big in information processing, you will see that most of our time will be spent on memory, but we'll also be touching on study skills, attention, fluency, among other topics. What is information processing? It's under the umbrella of cognitive processing, along with Piaget and Vygotsky from our last chapter. It looks at the mechanisms involved in intelligent thought, how information gets into our brain, how it's stored, how we pull it back out. It also involves all the things we might do with the information once we get it into our brain. It's hard to talk about information processing without introducing Sam Kirk. He was a psychologist who, early in his career, worked with adjudicated delinquents, and he quickly found that many of these individuals also had reading problems. This is unfortunately still true today. He noted that a fair number of them had at least average intelligence, but they were still struggling with reading. He spent most of his career at the University of Illinois, and along the way, he developed the Illinois Test of Psycholinguistic Abilities, the ITPA, now in its 3rd revision. This measure originally, among other areas, also assessed visual perception and visual motor functioning, but those areas have been dropped from this current edition. Now, why we remember Sam Kirk is from a speech that he made to the Council for Exceptional Children in 1964. He talked about children who had average intelligence, but for reasons other than a lack of learning opportunity, they had not been able to learn to read. He defined a new type of learning problem. Before Sam Kirk, if you had reading problems, you were either, and this is the term of his day, mentally retarded, or you were lazy. Now, he not only described these learners, he speculated as to the underlying reason for their learning problems, and he's also credited with naming the disorder. You know it as learning disabilities. He drew a parallel between the emerging computer model, computers were really new in 1964, and the human brain. We see parallels, like on this slide, which compares the two types of processing. We can also see these flowcharts with boxes and arrows that describe how something gets from point A to point B. This comes from early computer programming, but it's easily used to track the flow and steps of the thinking process. How information goes from one box to another is via mechanisms of change. I want to talk about several of these. Let's start with encoding. That's the process we use to get information into our brain, into our memory. Obviously, anyone who has problems with encoding is going to be experiencing some serious learning problems. Another mechanism is automaticity. We're going to be talking later about fluency. That's the speed at which you can process information. Automaticity is the top end of fluency. It is something you can do with virtually little to no effort. Examples would include writing your name, adding digits up to 10, providing your phone number. If you are automatic with a task, you're done. Now, strategy construction is developing and using a procedure for processing information, for learning something new. We're going to be talking about strategy construction later in this chapter. Think about it as having a plan of action, something beyond, and at this point, a miracle happens. Metacognition got a lot of attention several years ago. It's knowing about knowing, understanding how you think. We sometimes talk about being a visual learner or an auditory learner. We know that unless you have a sensory issue, you are capable of learning through any channel. But likely you do have a preferred channel. Most of us are visual learners or visual kinesthetic learners. Understanding your learning style, knowing about how you learn best, that's part of metacognition. Thinking about an activity before you approach it, while you're working on it, and after you've completed it, all tap into metacognitive processes. Now, the last of these mechanisms of change I want to mention is generalization. And with information processing, generalization is a good thing. It is being able to apply knowledge learned in one situation to another situation. It's the ultimate goal of education. It's not enough that you learn the material to pass the test. Your instructors want you to take that knowledge and apply it outside of the classroom. Now, moving along, the next definition we have is for thinking. What is thinking? That fundamental overweening cognitive process. This is Santrock's definition, which is as good as any. You can see it involves getting something into memory and then accessing it out of memory, but it also involves using that information in some manner, whether it's to generate new thoughts, understand something, or solve a problem. Now, when we started with information processing, I can tell you it was an exciting time. We had the idea that if we could identify what process had broken, then we might be able to fix it and thereby fix the struggling learner. Well, it didn't actually work this way for several big reasons. Let me give you an example. In the 70s, it was believed that reading was primarily a visual process. Anyone who was having reading problems, they had some kind of breakdown in their visual processing. So there were a number of measures we could administer to specifically identify what had broken down. Do you remember those perceptual activities we did during Chapter 2? We had visual matching, visual figure ground, visual closure, visual memory. Yeah, those all involve visual processing. Once we had identified an area that wasn't working, we could provide remedial activities, fix the broken process, thereby fix the reading problem. What we found out rather quickly was that we couldn't always fix the processing problem, and even when we were able to fix it, it hardly ever had any impact on the reading disorder. What we eventually realized was that identifying a broken process wasn't enough. Now, in this specific example, there are several things that went wrong. We now know that reading is primarily an auditory process. Now, about 10 to 15% of disabled readers do have problems with visual processing, but they are much less common than those with auditory difficulties. In this instance, we didn't even understand the academic process reading that was happening. We also didn't understand that even if you have the correct broken process, sometimes you can't fix it. We are operating within a time frame here. Remember Luria's brain theory? These are the secondary areas. They mature up until about age 10. So then that window closes. Now, even if you do fix the broken process, teaching that process in isolation did not automatically produce generalization. We had to co-join process remediation and teaching reading to begin to have the impact we wanted. But those failures that information processing encountered in the 70s cut the field off at its knees, and for a while, information processing as an area of study, it faded away. It's the end of our first section.